June 15th, 2026, today, this specific morning. Right now, as you are reading these words, 440 kilograms of near-weapons-grade uranium is sitting inside Iran's borders, physically measured, independently confirmed, and logged in the inspection records of the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is not an assertion from a briefing room. This is not a projection from a think tank model. This is a number that exists on paper signed by the Director General himself, cross-referenced by signals intelligence that has not stopped running a single hour since U.S. aircraft put massive ordnance penetrators down the vent shafts of an Iranian enrichment facility 13 months ago. CENTCOM knows where every gram of that material is. The United States intelligence community has been tracking this stockpile with a level of precision and continuity that Iran cannot interrupt, cannot deceive, and cannot escape. And here's the fact that changes everything about how you read the next 60 days. Iran had a clean exit from this situation. A legitimate, internationally credible IAEA-supervised off-ramp was offered. A neutral nation with more uranium expertise than almost any government on the planet raised its hand and said, "Place the material with us, we will watch it, nobody touches it, and everybody sleeps tonight." The Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran looked at that offer and issued a hard, internally directed, institutionally binding no. Not a diplomatic delay, not a request for more time. A no so firm it took only 9 days to harden from an initial refusal into a Supreme Leader-level directive that has no institutional pathway for reversal. And the United States government did not respond to that no with a press release. They responded with something that sounded exactly like a countdown clock with a set of coordinates already attached to it. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why Iran's rejection of the Kazakhstan proposal is not just a diplomatic setback, but a strategic declaration with military consequences attached, you need to understand what Iran's nuclear program has actually been building toward for the last 20 years. Not what the official statements claim, not what the diplomatic language suggests, but what the architecture of the program itself reveals when you strip away the narrative and look at the physics. Iran's enrichment program was never primarily about electricity generation. The Islamic Republic sits on some of the largest proven oil and natural gas reserves on the planet. It has no structural need for nuclear energy that civilian reactor technology alone could not have satisfied years ago at a fraction of the political cost. What Iran has been building, methodically and across multiple presidential administrations and multiple rounds of sanctions and multiple rounds of negotiations, is a permanent unresolved capability, a technical threshold maintained just close enough to weapons production to be meaningful as a deterrence instrument, and just far enough from a declared weapon to avoid the definitive international response that an actual test would trigger. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action temporarily capped enrichment levels and reduced stockpiles in exchange for sanctions relief. When the United States withdrew from that agreement in 2018, Iran did not sprint toward weapons-grade material overnight. What it did was rebuild its enrichment infrastructure, expand its centrifuge cascade, and push its enrichment levels upward in measured, documented increments that the IAEA recorded in every quarterly report. By 2023, Iran was enriching to 60% purity at multiple facilities simultaneously. By mid-2024, the stockpile at that enrichment level had crossed the threshold at which serious analysts stopped using the word near and started using the word breakout. The foundational reality that makes everything happening today matter at the scale it matters is this: 60% enrichment is not a civilian number. Reactor fuel operates at 3 to 5%. Research reactor fuel operates at 20%. Medical isotope production does not require 60% enrichment under any technical framework that exists. The only reason to enrich to 60% is to make the jump to 90% weapons-grade material as fast as physically possible. And that jump from 60 to 90% is technically the shortest, fastest step in the entire enrichment ladder. The hardest work is already done at 60%. That is the baseline from which everything that follows must be understood. Here is where the situation stands today, with specific confirmed numbers and verified operational facts. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi flew personally to Astana, Kazakhstan within the last 3 weeks and conducted direct government-to-government meetings with President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. The agenda of those meetings was the formalization of Kazakhstan's offer to physically host Iran's entire enriched uranium stockpile, all 440 kilograms of it, under full IAEA safeguards and continuous international monitoring. Simultaneously in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed 40 nations' defense ministers and stated publicly, clearly, and without diplomatic ambiguity that the United States is more than capable of resuming military strikes against Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and that American weapons stockpiles are more than adequate for such operations. Read the context of that statement carefully. This was not a congressional hearing. This was not a domestic press briefing designed for American political consumption. This was the United States Secretary of Defense in front of 40 governments representing the entire Asian defense establishment, delivering a message that every person in that room understood was not hypothetical. At that exact moment, while Hegseth was speaking in Singapore, the naval blockade of Iran was running at full operational tempo, extracting an estimated $500 million per day from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operating budget. Reports emerging from within Iran describe IRGC mid-level commanders not receiving scheduled payments. The patronage networks, the informal loyalty payments, the financial architecture that holds the Revolutionary Guard together as a coherent institution, all of it is being drained by a mechanism Iran cannot simply ignore or work around. These three simultaneous realities, the diplomatic push through Kazakhstan, the public military posture announced in Singapore, and the financial strangulation of the IRGC, are not separate storylines running in parallel. They are a single, coordinated, multi-axis pressure campaign, and understanding the convergence of those axes is the only way to understand what Iran's refusal actually reveals about its true strategic posture. Kazakhstan's proposal deserves the full analytical weight that the cable news coverage has consistently failed to give it, because what Iran rejected tells you far more about Iranian intentions than what Iran said. Kazakhstan is not a random country raising its hand for attention or international relevance. It produces 6% of the world's total uranium output, making it the single largest uranium-producing nation on the planet by a margin that is not close. It hosted the P5+1 diplomatic talks with Iran in 2013, demonstrating both the depth of its diplomatic neutrality and its institutional capacity to manage the highest stakes international negotiations without partisan contamination. And it operates the only IAEA low-enriched uranium fuel bank functioning anywhere on Earth, a facility specifically designed and internationally validated to store nuclear material under continuous safeguards as a structural guarantee against weaponization. If you were designing from first principles the single most credible, most legitimate, most technically qualified neutral custodian for the most sensitive nuclear material in existence, you would describe Kazakhstan. The terms of the proposal were simple in structure but enormous in strategic consequence. Iran's entire 440-kilogram stockpile would be physically transferred to Kazakhstan. It would remain under full IAEA safeguards, meaning continuous monitoring, unannounced inspections, and zero access by any party, including Iran, without full international authorization. The material would be effectively removed from the military equation without being destroyed. Iran could retain technical ownership on paper while eliminating the weapons potential that makes the stockpile an active crisis requiring active response. This was, stripped of all diplomatic language, the cleanest off-ramp any government in Iran's position has ever been offered in the history of nuclear non-proliferation negotiations. Iran could have walked away from the table with its nuclear program technically intact, its sovereignty argument preserved at the IAEA level, and the B-2 spirit back in its hangar. The fact that this offer was rejected is not a diplomatic footnote. The fact that it was rejected at the supreme leader level, with the explicit stated reasoning that surrendering the material would leave Iran more vulnerable, is a declaration of strategic intent that eliminates every remaining argument about civilian nuclear purpose. Iran's foreign ministry announced publicly and without ambiguity that there will be no understanding with the United States until the naval blockade is lifted first. Read that again, slowly. Iran is demanding the removal of every piece of American economic and financial leverage. The blockade currently extracting $500 million per day from the IRGC, the sanctions architecture collapsing Iran's access to international financial systems, the complete removal of the pressure that is currently dissolving the institutional cohesion of the Revolutionary Guard, before it will surrender a single gram of enriched uranium or engage in any substantive negotiation about the material itself. This is not a negotiating position. This is the language of a regime that has read its own hand correctly and knows it is losing, because the demand structure reveals everything. A government negotiating from strength asks for concessions in exchange for concessions. It offers something of value in exchange for something of value. It creates a transaction with defined terms on both sides of the ledger. A government negotiating from desperation asks for all leverage to be removed first, before putting anything on its own side of the table. Iran's sequencing, lift the blockade entirely, then we will discuss the uranium, is precisely the demand structure of a government that understands the moment any financial pressure comes off. Even marginally, its only remaining bargaining chip becomes the sole focus of the conversation, and the pressure to surrender it only intensifies. The word Iran, used to justify keeping the uranium inside its borders, is the most revealing word in this entire situation. Vulnerable. They said surrendering the material would leave Iran more vulnerable. That is not the vocabulary of a civilian energy program discussing reactor fuel logistics or enrichment economics. That is a regime describing a weapons asset by the precise strategic function it serves in the regime's survival architecture. The 440 kilograms is not a fuel reserve. By Iran's own word choice, it is a deterrence instrument. It is a card that cannot leave the table, because without it, the table itself disappears. I want you to hear this carefully. Iran's public messaging since the Kazakhstan rejection has followed a specific, recognizable, and historically familiar pattern. State media has framed the refusal as a principled sovereign assertion against American coercion. The Supreme Leader's office has characterized the uranium stockpile as a symbol of national technological achievement built by Iranian scientists under decades of sanctions and threats. Foreign ministry spokespeople have accused the United States of bad faith, arguing that Washington violated the 2015 nuclear deal first, and therefore holds no legitimate standing to demand Iranian concessions now. They have labeled the naval blockade an act of economic warfare against a civilian population. They have attempted to draw explicit comparisons to the 2003 Iraq intelligence failures, deliberately seeding doubt about whether American intelligence on Iranian nuclear capabilities is as solid and documented as it is being presented to the international community. Now contrast that rhetoric with what has actually happened. In June of 2025, Operation Midnight Hammer put U.S. aircraft into Iranian airspace without the Iranian air defense network providing any meaningful resistance to the operation. Not as a warning strike, as a live combat operation that delivered 14 massive ordnance penetrators against active Iranian enrichment infrastructure, destroyed centrifuge halls, and left Iran without its primary enrichment processing capability for a period measured not in weeks, but in months. The S-300 air defense systems that Iran had spent billions acquiring and deploying were suppressed so rapidly and so thoroughly that they provided zero protection to the facilities they were supposed to defend. Iran's missile leadership was eliminated, its proxy networks throughout the region, the organizations that gave Iran its regional deterrence reach without requiring direct Iranian military engagement, have been progressively degraded. The Houthi campaign attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea was rolled back. The political and military architecture that Iran built over 2 decades to project power beyond its borders has been systematically, methodically, and almost completely dismantled. And yet the public rhetoric from Tehran continues to describe a government negotiating from principle, from strength, and from an unassailable moral position. The gap between what Iran is saying and what has verifiably happened to Iran's military and economic posture is not a communications problem. It is the gap between a regime's need to maintain domestic legitimacy and the operational reality of how few cards actually remain in the hand. Who is actually making decisions inside the Iranian government right now? The answer to that question is less clear than the publicly visible institutional structure suggests, and the ambiguity itself has strategic consequences that go beyond personnel management. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is 85 years old. His health has been the subject of persistent and credible reporting within intelligence analytical circles for more than a year. The June 2025 strikes did not only target enrichment infrastructure, they eliminated several senior figures in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command structure, including individuals who served as critical intermediaries between the Supreme Leader's office and IRGC operational decision-making. Their replacements are less experienced, less institutionally connected, and dramatically less familiar with the back-channel diplomatic infrastructure that has historically provided Iran with informal communication pathways to Western interlocutors during periods of open confrontation. The nuclear decision-making architecture in Iran formally runs through the Supreme National Security Council, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, and the IRGC's strategic forces and aerospace divisions. What changed after the Midnight Hammer strikes is that several key nodes in that decision chain no longer exist. The directive that the enriched uranium shall not leave Iranian territory did not come through the Foreign Ministry's Technical Arms Control Division. It was issued as a direct internal order from the Supreme Leader's office, bypassing the diplomatic expertise of the ministry entirely. That bypass tells you something important about the current state of Iranian decision-making. When a government bypasses its own technical experts and diplomatic specialists to issue a direct command on the most consequential strategic question it faces, that government is not deliberating. It is executing a pre-committed position. Pre-committed positions do not negotiate. They hold until the external pressure changes the calculus so fundamentally that the position itself becomes untenable. The question for the next 30 to 60 days is which breaks first, the pre-committed position or the external pressure maintaining it. Let me explain exactly what the United States military's targeting and surveillance architecture looks like right now, because this is the layer of the situation that changes how every other element reads, and it is the part that never gets broken down with the precision it deserves. Layer 1 is the RC-135 rivet joint. The United States Air Force operates 22 of these aircraft, and they are the most continuously employed signals intelligence platforms in the entire American military inventory. An estimated 4 are currently deployed to regional basing, and running uninterrupted collection operations over Iran's nuclear infrastructure without a single gap in coverage. The rivet joint does not drop weapons. It does not require weapons to be decisive. What it does is systematically vacuum up every electronic emission across every site connected to Iran's nuclear program. Communications between enrichment facilities, power grid signatures consistent with active centrifuge operations, radar emissions from vehicle convoys near known material storage locations, communications between facility security personnel and regional Revolutionary Guard commands. Every time Iran moves anything in the vicinity of its nuclear infrastructure, any vehicle, any power fluctuation near a known site, any convoy of the size and type consistent with nuclear material transport, the RC-135 logs it, and the targeting solution that already exists updates in real time. There's no movement Iran can make with this material that the collection architecture does not record. This is not surveillance. This is continuous targeting. The distinction matters because it means the problem the B-2 Spirit would be asked to solve is not a fixed location problem. It is a continuously updated dynamic targeting problem that the intelligence architecture has been solving in real time for months without interruption. Layer 2 is the F-35A Lightning II, the aircraft that was first into Iranian airspace during Operation Midnight Hammer and will be first in again if the political decision is made. The F-35A carries the AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radar, a distributed aperture system providing 360-degree situational awareness without any blind spots, and a comprehensive electronic warfare suite capable of detecting, identifying, and suppressing enemy radar and communication systems simultaneously in the same combat pass. During Midnight Hammer, F-35As suppressed the Iranian air defense network so comprehensively that the entire system was effectively rendered operationally blind before the penetrating aircraft reached their targets. Those same aircraft are flying persistent missions over the Strait of Hormuz right now, passing targeting data continuously across the joint force. Layer 3 is the F-22 Raptor, deployed throughout the regional theater with a primary air superiority tasking. The Raptor's mission is to clear the operational environment so that whatever strike package comes next moves through it without interference. The F-22's assessed capability against ballistic missiles in boost phase means that Iranian attempts to respond to a strike with the missile systems that remain in its inventory face an intercept threat beginning at the moment of launch. And then there is the delivery vehicle that closes every conversation about what the United States can physically reach. The B-2 Spirit strategic stealth bomber carries a maximum payload of approximately 40,000 pounds of precision ordnance, including the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound GPS and inertially guided weapon specifically designed for one category of target, deeply buried, heavily hardened facilities, constructed with the explicit purpose of surviving every conventional weapon in any adversary's inventory. Now let us talk about Pickaxe Mountain, because this is where the physics of this situation becomes the most consequential technical question anyone in any government is currently trying to answer. Iran buried its primary enriched uranium storage under approximately 280 feet of solid granite. That number is not symbolic. That number is a calculated engineering answer to a specific question. How deep do you go before the massive ordnance penetrator can no longer guarantee destruction of the facility beneath it? The Midnight Hammer strikes in June 2025 penetrated facilities that were significantly shallower than 280 feet. The political will question is where the next 60 days are being decided. The operational numbers embedded in this situation each carry a story that raw statistics cannot tell alone, and every number requires the analysis that reveals its real meaning. 440 kilograms is the confirmed IAEA measured weight of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. At 60% enrichment, that quantity of material represents feedstock sufficient for approximately 11 nuclear devices if further processed to 90% weapons-grade threshold. That calculation is not a worst-case scenario projection. It is a straightforward application of weapons physics to a confirmed material quantity at a confirmed enrichment level. The jump from 60 to 90% is the shortest and fastest step in the enrichment process. The most technically demanding centrifuge work is already complete at 60%. This is why Western governments treat 60% enrichment at this scale not as a future proliferation risk, but as a present-tense near-weapons capability that requires present-tense response. $500 million per day is being extracted from the IRGC operating budget by the naval blockade. Multiply that figure by the 16 days since Iran formally rejected the Kazakhstan proposal, and you arrive at approximately $8 billion removed from the Revolutionary Guard's financial architecture in a window of time shorter than a single fiscal quarter. The IRGC is not a conventional military funded by Defense Ministry appropriations. It is a business empire with military capabilities, sustained by control of Iran's import-export economy, its construction sector, its energy infrastructure, and its informal financial networks. The blockade does not simply reduce the budget. It attacks the economic ecosystem that sustains the Guard's institutional loyalty, its personnel retention, and its operational capacity simultaneously. 14 massive ordnance penetrators were delivered during Operation Midnight Hammer. That number deserves to be held for a moment. 14, not a demonstration strike, not a warning shot designed to signal displeasure and invite negotiation. A comprehensive, sequenced, multi-target destruction package designed to end the operational capacity of specific nuclear facilities for a period measured in years. The rebuilding timeline for the infrastructure destroyed in that operation, estimated by technical analysts who have reviewed the available imagery, is measured not in months, but in years of effort under sanctions. 9 days was the period between Iran's initial refusal of the Kazakhstan offer and the hardening of that refusal into a supreme leader-level directive with zero ambiguity. 9 days of internal debate, internal argument, and internal political conflict. And the outcome was a position with no institutional pathway for reversal. 2 people were injured, and a residential apartment building in the Romanian city of Galați was struck when a Russian drone crossed a NATO member state's sovereign border during an overnight strike package targeting Ukrainian infrastructure. That sentence, held in isolation, describes what was once considered inconceivable within the NATO alliance framework. A member state's civilian infrastructure struck by Russian ordnance. 40 nations' defense ministers heard the United States Secretary of Defense announce active strike readiness against Iran's nuclear infrastructure before a multinational audience that included every major Asian defense establishment. The message was not ambiguous. The audience was not incidental. The timing was not accidental. Now, pull all 3 tracks together. Because what is happening with Iran's nuclear program is not a single-dimension military confrontation. It is a compound pressure campaign running simultaneously on financial, military, and psychological axes. And the convergence of those 3 tracks is what makes this moment qualitatively different from every previous chapter of this decades-long confrontation. The financial track is the stranglehold operating below the surface of every news headline. The naval blockade extracting $500 million per day is not simply an economic sanction applied to a government's revenue line. It is the systematic, continuous removal of the IRGC's operational capacity at the institutional level, its ability to pay fighters on schedule, fund proxy organizations in Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq, maintain sophisticated equipment, and project organized power beyond Iran's own borders. IRGC mid-level commanders not receiving scheduled payments is not a logistical inconvenience. It is a loyalty dissolution event occurring inside the institution that holds the Islamic Republic together through coercion and financial patronage. In a regime that runs on exactly those mechanisms, loyalty dissolution is not a personnel problem. It is an existential structural threat. The accumulated financial damage from $8 billion extracted in the period since the Kazakhstan rejection alone is not recoverable in any timeline shorter than years, assuming the blockade ends. The military track is the visible architecture of the pressure, visible not because it is performing, but because the visibility itself is the message. The B-2 on alert. The F-35A persistent missions over the Strait of Hormuz. The F-22 deployed throughout the regional theater, clearing the operational environment. The RC-135 logging every movement near every nuclear facility without interruption. The targeting solution continuously updated and maintained in current status. The CENTCOM flight plan over Pickaxe Mountain. The Secretary of Defense's public statement in Singapore before 40 governments. All of this together is not theater. Theater looks different. Theater is press releases and strongly worded official statements. What the U.S. military is running is a continuously maintained live targeting solution attached to a delivery mechanism already present in the theater, with a political authorization already communicated through the Secretary of Defense's public remarks. The difference between a military posture and an operational countdown is the continuous maintenance of a current targeting solution, and that maintenance is confirmed and ongoing. The psychological track is the least visible, and in some ways, the most consequential pressure being applied. Iran's leadership is watching its financial architecture drain in real time. The psychological weight of knowing your last card is simultaneously your only card, and that the adversary across the table has specifically engineered the weapon designed to take that card away from you kinetically does not show up in press releases or diplomatic communiques, but it shows up in the language. It shows up in a supreme leader bypassing his own foreign ministry to issue a direct internal order that uranium shall not leave. It shows up in 9 days of internal argument hardening into an absolute directive. It shows up in foreign ministry statements, demanding the removal of all leverage before any negotiation begins. That is not the language of confidence. That is a cornered regime describing, through its very specific demands, exactly how trapped it understands itself to be. Here is what serious analysts are watching right now that is not getting the attention it deserves. And here is the structural risk nobody is naming in the open source conversation. The 60-day framework currently in operation preserves every American option simultaneously. The blockade continues running. The strike package remains postured at operational readiness. The diplomatic channel through Kazakhstan remains technically open, and the RC-135 keeps logging. But the preservation of all options simultaneously also means none of the options are being executed. And every day without resolution is a day during which Iran retains the 440 kilograms and potentially moves the material incrementally closer to whatever deeper geological formation it is engineering. Iran has spent decades demonstrating an extraordinary institutional capacity for nuclear program dispersal, deception, and the identification of sites that the IAEA's declared facility inspection mandate cannot reach without Iranian cooperation. The structural risk that serious analysts are sitting with tonight is not whether the current 440 kilogram location is known. The RC-135 and the targeting solution both confirm that it is. The structural risk is whether the material can be moved, dispersed across multiple smaller caches, distributed across different geological formations, before the diplomatic window closes in a way that changes the kinetic problem from solvable to catastrophically expensive. If Iran disperses the material into multiple caches buried at varying depths across the country, the single-strike solution that Midnight Hammer demonstrated against a consolidated facility becomes a multi-strike campaign against distributed targets, with dramatically higher escalation risk, dramatically less certainty of complete material elimination, and dramatically greater international political resistance to execution. This is not speculation about future Iranian behavior. It is the historical pattern of how Iran has consistently managed its nuclear program when under maximum external pressure. Distribute, disperse, force the adversary into an escalatory commitment that requires sustained strikes against distributed targets, and thus generates the international political opposition that constrains American military action. There is also the second crisis, running simultaneously in the background, that is dividing alliance attention in ways that matter strategically. A Russian drone struck a residential apartment building in Galați, Romania, on the night of June 13th. Romania is an Article 5 NATO member state. 2 people were injured. The building is residential civilian infrastructure. Romania's foreign ministry has labeled the event a serious violation of international law. NATO air defense networks are on heightened alert across the entire Eastern European flank as a direct consequence of that single event. Zelensky is simultaneously warning of a massive incoming Russian strike package, drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, sequenced within a tight operational window targeting Ukrainian infrastructure across multiple regions. NATO's attention, its political bandwidth, and its member state military capacity are not infinite, and every hour that alliance decision-makers are managing an Article 5 discussion about Romanian civilian infrastructure is an hour of reduced political focus on the Iranian nuclear standoff. The adversaries in both theaters understand this dynamic. It would be strategically irrational for them not to exploit it. And a final structural risk that no administration wants to say out loud, but every honest analyst with access to the full operational picture understands: if the B2 pathway is executed and the 280-foot granite problem at Pickaxe Mountain is solved kinetically, the downstream response from Iran operates without a ceiling. Iran's remaining response options, though degraded, include Strait of Hormuz disruption of global energy transit, activation of remaining proxy networks in Lebanon and Iraq, ballistic missile launches against regional partners, and sophisticated cyber operations against critical infrastructure in the United States and allied nations. Any one of those responses triggers a cascade of reactions from multiple actors across the region. The cascade does not have a negotiated endpoint. It does not have a defined termination condition. It operates by its own escalatory logic once initiated, and the American service members who would be asked to manage that cascade, the military families watching this right now who have already carried the weight of every decision like this one for more than 20 years, are not the architects of the policy that creates the cascade. They are the people who live inside its consequences. June 15th, 2026. Today. Right now. The same morning this script opened, 440 kilograms of near weapons-grade uranium is sitting inside Iran's borders, and the world's most sophisticated military targeting architecture is tracking every gram of it in real time without a single hour of interruption. Iran had an exit. A credible, internationally legitimate IAEA-supervised off-ramp was offered by the single most qualified neutral custodian on the planet. The terms preserved Iranian sovereignty, preserved Iran's technical ownership of the material on paper, and removed the one element that makes the stockpile a crisis requiring active military response. The Supreme Leader said no, not because the offer was technically flawed, not because the conditions were diplomatically unacceptable. He said no because the 440 kilograms is not a fuel reserve and not an energy security measure and not a technological achievement to be celebrated. By Iran's own choice of language, the word vulnerable, those 440 kilograms are the last structural guarantee of regime survival in a post-conflict settlement that Iran knows it is losing. The financial architecture that holds the Revolutionary Guard together is draining at $500 million per day. The air defense network that was supposed to protect the enrichment infrastructure was suppressed in a single operation. The missile leadership was removed. The centrifuge halls were destroyed by 14 massive ordnance penetrators. The proxy networks that gave Iran regional deterrence without direct Iranian military engagement have been progressively dismantled. The political and military architecture Iran built across 2 decades to ensure its relevance to the regional strategic equation has been, one element at a time, taken apart. And what remains is 440 kilograms of enriched uranium buried under 280 feet of solid granite inside a mountain range that CENTCOM has filed a flight plan over. That is not leverage from strength. That is a cornered position being held by a regime that correctly understands the material is the last thing between it and total strategic irrelevance in whatever architecture gets built when this conflict ends. Iran does not want the bomb as a deliverable weapon on a near-term timeline. Iran wants the existential threat of the bomb to sit in the room at every future conversation about what the Islamic Republic looks like in the settlement that comes after. The moment those 440 kilograms leave Iranian soil, the regime believes it becomes a country with no leverage, no protection, and no guarantee of survival in any negotiated framework. The moment they stay, the B-2 spirit is the thing that eventually finalizes the conversation. There was never going to be a clean answer to a problem this shape. The American taxpayer is funding both options simultaneously. The American veteran has already paid for the decade of decisions that created this specific moment. And the military family watching this tonight is the one who will carry the consequences of whatever decision gets made in the next 30 days, not the officials who make it, not the contractors who rebuild the stockpile afterward. The real weight on the table is not the uranium. It is the cost borne by people who had no voice in the decision and no choice about the outcome. So here's the question. The only question that actually matters tonight, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. Does the uranium move to Kazakhstan in the next 30 days under IAEA supervision, removing the military option from the table, preserving Iran as a functioning regime with the institutional capacity to restart its nuclear program somewhere deeper underground the moment the diplomatic pressure relaxes? Or does the B-2 finalize this conversation, eliminate the material permanently, and open a cascade of downstream consequences with no defined endpoint, no negotiated termination condition, and no ceiling on the cost paid by the people who were never in the room when the decision was made? One path preserves the regime and leaves the threat alive to reconstitute itself. The other eliminates the threat and detonates the region. Tell me which one you believe happens in the next 30 days. And tell me what country you're watching from, because this conversation is genuinely global, and the answer to that question looks different depending on where you live, who your government is allied with, and how close you are to either the Strait of Hormuz or the Romanian border, where a Russian drone landed in a civilian apartment building 2 days ago. The next chapter of this story is moving faster than any news cycle can keep pace with, and the moment the decision is made, everything changes simultaneously. What do you think happens next?